Hello friends, welcome to our Soviet Journey channel. I wanted to give you information about the history of Ukraine in this video. I want to tell to you the facts about Ukraine, both its history and the Sovietization period. You remember that in the days when the conflicts between Ukraine and Russia began, Russian President Vladimir Putin said, "There is no country called Ukraine." Beyond looking at it as a country, when we look at the people living in the region from a cultural and class perspective, historical processes become even more detailed. Therefore, looking at the foundation of Ukraine and the liberation of the peoples in the region in the light of history and culture will shed more accurate light on the subject. Let's take a look at the history of Ukraine together. The history of the Slavs, the most populous ethnic community living in Europe, goes back a long way. Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians, who were historically examined in the Eastern Slavs group, have shared cultural heritage over many periods. With the entry of the armies of the Mongol Empire into Kiev in the 13th century, the histories of the peoples inhabiting the lands of Russia and Ukraine had to diverge. However, years later, the Principality of Moscow regained control of the region and re-established the cultural partnership. Afterwards, the policy of the dominant Tsarist Russia on the Ukrainian lands turned into more assimilation and Russianism. In other words, what was initially considered a unity of the Slavs turned into oppression in the historical process. Tsarist Russia considered Ukrainians and Belarusians to be ethnically Russian and called them Little Russians. Due to the great repressions until the end of World War I, only a small group of Ukrainian nationalists could oppose this view. During this period, a series of measures aimed at Russifying the Little Russians were taken as a result of a perceived threat of Ukrainian separatism by the Tsarist administration. In 1804, the Ukrainian language was banned as the language of instruction in schools. In 1876, teaching in Ukrainian language, printing books, holding public events, and even printing Ukrainian texts accompanying musical scores were prohibited. During the reign of Tsarist Russia, which was called the Hell of the Peoples, Ukrainians, like many other peoples, had their share of the oppressive policy. Official relations were established between the provisional government, which came to power with the February Revolution of 1917, and the Central Rada of Ukraine, represented by Petro Stebnitsky. In June 1917, the Ukrainian People's Republic was established, and Dmitry Adonets was appointed Minister of Russian Affairs in the Ukrainian government. After the collapse of the Tsarist regime with the October Revolution, an autonomous Ukrainian Republic was established in Kiev, whose main leaders were Vinichenko and Petliura. In December of the same year, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic was declared. During the Brest-Litovsk Treaty negotiations, following the end of the occupation of Ukraine by the German armies, the Petliura administration came to power in December 1918. Between 1919 and 1921, violent battles took place between the White Army under the command of Denikin and Wrangel in Ukraine and the Red Army supporting the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic established under the leadership of Rakovsky in March 1919. During this period, the war that the Petliura administration continued against the Red Army by making an agreement with Poland ended with the Riga Treaty between Soviet Russia and the Second Polish Republic in 1921. The other country that founded the Soviet Union together with Soviet Russia in 1922 was Soviet Ukraine. In other words, the foundation of the Soviet Union is actually based on Russia and Ukraine. It was useful to remind this brief historical process, because we can say that Ukrainians, who have had relations with Russian people for centuries, are angry because of the assimilation policies of the Tsarist period, and that anti-Russianism has emerged, especially under the influence of nationalist groups. Although this situation decreased with the establishment of Soviet power and increased efforts to develop Ukrainian culture in all areas, it is known that ultranationalist groups always fuel hostility. Along with Sovietization, the policies of Koreanization, translated as nativization, were expanded in Ukraine as the exact opposite of assimilation and aimed to eliminate Russian dominance and culture over non-Russian nations. During this period, all bans on the Ukrainian language were abolished. Activities were carried out to gain national reputations. Local people were brought to the forefront by representatives and administrative administrations. In Ukraine, all children began to be taught the Ukrainian language at school. The People's Commissariat for Education of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic dated October 31, 1918 issued a decree on schools of national minorities. This decision included the following articles. All nationalities living in Soviet Russia enjoy the right to organize education in their native language at both levels of the United Labor School and higher education institutions. National minority schools are opened in places where there are enough students of a certain nationality to organize a school. In order to foster cultural rapprochement and class solidarity among workers of different nationalities, compulsory teaching of the language of the majority of the regional population in national minority schools is widespread. The Koreanization policies adopted in 1923 included instruction and cultural life in all languages used in the Soviet republics. At the same time, a number of units were created in the administrations of the Union republics and in the party, including the creation of a special Soviet administrative group called Natsvrani meaning national regions, Natsovety meaning national councils units for a time. For example, in the late 1920s there were even Natsovety for Russians and Estonians in Ukraine. In short, with Sovietization, all the cultural factors necessary for a people to exist were revealed. In fact, this nationalities policy was formulated by the Bolshevik Party in 1913, for years before they came to power in Russia, by Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin. Even Stalin, who was a Georgian himself, summarized these ideas in his work Marxism and the National Question in the same year. This policy aimed to reverse decades of Russification and develop people's own languages in response to the assimilation that took place during the Tsarist period. Thanks to this, many non-Russian groups that were previously anti-Bolshevik under the influence of Western countries began to side with the Soviets, and national hostilities greatly diminished. It is very important to be able to read historical processes when explaining current events. The first thing we need to keep in mind is what Ukraine was founded and built on as a country. First of all Soviet administrations were established on the basis of working-class leadership. In the social order formed on the basis of the collective governance of the working masses, there is no room for national hostilities and it is aimed to be destroyed in some way. With the Sovietization of Ukraine, exploitative classes were abolished, the cultural assimilation policies of the Tsarist period were ended, and great cultural progress was made. In other words, as Lenin said, all power has passed to the Soviets. In direct response to this, the way was opened for the people to govern themselves through direct democracy, and a self-government based on the achievements of the international working class came to power all over the world. Regardless of Russia's post-Soviet policy, Vladimir Putin said the following during his speech on recognizing the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics on February 21, 2022. Soviet Ukraine is the result of the policy of the Bolsheviks and can rightfully be called Vladimir Lenin's Ukraine. He was the creator and architect of the country, and today the so-called grateful generation has torn down the monuments of Lenin in Ukraine. They call it decommunization. These sentences in which Putin refers to the subject are about the historical process in question. The right of nations to self-determination has always been an indispensable principle of socialists. This voluntary connection between the peoples living in Ukraine and other Soviet peoples was established in such a process. With Sovietization, Ukrainians achieved a great cultural breakthrough and took their place firmly on the stage of history as a nation. If we compare the policies of the Tsarist period with the policies of the period when the people governed themselves together with the Soviet administration, it will be clearly seen how the Ukrainians broke all the chains of oppression and assimilation, how they made rapid cultural strides, and how they planted the seeds of living together with other Soviet peoples on the principle of internationalism. Yes friends, in this video, I will give you information about the Soviet history of Ukraine. As you know, Ukraine has been a subject of much debate, especially in recent times. I hope this historical video was helpful to you in this regard and you liked the content. If you have any topics you would like to contribute to, please write them in the comments so we can discuss them together. I produce various videos on little-known topics related to the Soviets. You can find all of these on our Soviet Journey channel. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow us. See you again in other videos. Goodbye for now.